All right, welcome, folks. And thank you to Sophie and Pollock and the PRISM team for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here because I'm really excited to kind of spread the gospel of like tech art and working across disciplines and giving you cool projects to kind of expand your mind and expand your ways of thinking that aren't just all about classes, right? I'll talk a little bit about that as I go through. My name is Rob Gorbet, and I'm gonna talk today a little bit about myself and my path, because some of you may be interested in how that came to be, how I came to be working at this space of intersection between art and engineering. And I'll probably say a few things about collaboration, because I think, and particularly interdisciplinary collaboration, because I think that's really important for us to develop skills in, and PRISM is a way that you can start to practice and develop those skills. And I'll talk a little bit about the history, not too much, of tech art, and then take you on a little bit of a journey through some pieces that I've been involved in, or had the fortune to be involved in. And then I hope to leave, a fair bit of time for just discussion. So hopefully you'll have questions. Start thinking about them now. So let's start with sort of who I am. I am a professional engineer. I got my PhD in electrical engineering from Waterloo. I did control systems. In my PhD, I worked on shape memory alloys. So those of you that have heard of flexinol or muscle wire or nitinol or nickel titanium, those are words for all the same thing. A nickel titanium shape memory alloy, which is a metal that remembers its shape and returns to its remembered shape when it's heated. So that's what my PhD was in, developing control systems for shape memory alloys. I taught in engineering at Waterloo for 10 years, so I was hired in 2000 in part to help start the mechatronics engineering program, and I taught in ECE until 2010. In 2002, I started collaborating with designers and artists to integrate technology into their creative works. I'll talk a little bit about how that came to be. In 2004, as a result of my involvement there, I had the opportunity to start a course that's called Technology Art Studio. It's an occasional course, and Brandon DeHart, who's sitting against the wall over there, and some of you may recognize as the RoboHub lead, or manager, or director, or whatever your title is. Brandon, Brandon took the tech art course in 2004 or 5? Sometime a long time ago. And then did a master's with me, did a PhD with me, and now works at the university in charge of RoboHub, and now gets to teach that tech art course when it's offered. But the idea was to provide an opportunity for upper year engineers to collaborate with upper year sculpture students from fine arts, and to put them together in a kind of capstone design course for 4 months. And they actually built interactive sculptures that we would then exhibit open to the public. 2010, I had the opportunity to move to what was then a brand new program on campus, the Department of Knowledge Integration, and that move was really precipitated by wanting to find a place where interdisciplinarity was more valued. 15 years ago in electrical and computer engineering, the idea of interdisciplinary was like a control systems engineer working with a power engineer. And for me, that just wasn't doing it. So I was very happy to have this opportunity to move over to knowledge integration. Now, 15 years later, engineering is definitely much more interdisciplinary than it was. And so it's really exciting to me to see the opportunities, not just for engineers, but for students from other parts of campus to start to get together to collaborate on things, because I have thought for 2 decades now that this is the right way to solve the world's problems. Can I just get a show of hands? How many in the room are in engineering? And how many are in like CS, math? Okay, and how many are in science? Any arts? Yeah, okay, couple, one. What arts have you declared a major yet? Oh, GBA, yeah, okay, great. So thank you for coming from Stratford. Did you come from Stratford? Oh, okay, so you're an alum, all right. Anyone from health? And anyone from environment? Okay, a couple from environment. Okay. So it's neat to have these spaces where people can start to come together from across disciplines to work together. So that's kind of my journey. Why do I think that interdisciplinary collaboration is so important? So some of this will be new to you, and some of you will say, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But one of the biggest things about interdisciplinary collaboration, working across different knowledge systems, different ways of knowing, ways of posing and answering questions, is that it's fun and it challenges us. It challenges us to think differently than we've necessarily or perhaps been taught in our home disciplines. It also opens up your mind to new ideas. So different people from different disciplines think differently, and that's, you can hear that said and kind of believe it in the abstract, but then when you actually collaborate across disciplines, you're like, oh wow, this is what Rob meant, right? Like people actually do think differently, create knowledge differently, consume knowledge differently. What counts as evidence for a historian is not the same thing that counts as evidence for a biologist. So there really are differences, right? But one of the things that we know is that the problems we face don't live within those disciplinary silos, so we have to know how, if we're going to be effective at solving the world's problems, collaborate across disciplines, understand each other, value and leverage the knowledge that others bring. And so PRISM, or Collaborative Interdisciplinary Technology Art, is a space, a place, where you can practice those skills. Right? Before you go out into the real world and all of a sudden you're like, man, I've been surrounded by engineers for 4 years, 5 years. Now I've got to work with, the business people and the marketing people and so on. And I've added this more recently to this talk. The world is like falling apart in a sort of polarization way, right? We have camps of people that are not listening to each other. And one of the skills that interdisciplinary collaboration gives you is the ability, if you're doing it well, to listen and really hear other perspectives and value those other perspectives. And so I think the more we can teach interdisciplinarity on campuses, the better we're preparing the next generation of people to be less polarized, right? Critical consumers of information, effective listeners, and so on. So I think interdisciplinary collaboration is really critical. Art and engineering is one form of interdisciplinary collaboration, and it's the form that has informed what I do for the last 2 decades. This is a picture of Billy Kluver. Billy Kluver was a research engineer at Bell Labs in New York City in the, I'll say, 60s, right? He lived from 27 to 2004, but primarily active in the 60s in the art and technology world. And he founded an organization called EAT, or Experiments in Art and Technology. And essentially this was motivated by him in his social time hanging out with artists like Robert Rauschenberg, Andy Warhol, Jasper Johns, in the 1960s New York City, going to events, probably smoking a lot of dope, and just in his day job doing all the engineering stuff, and then in his social life being engaged in all these sort of creative what-if questions. Right? And he started to get involved in designing and building things for his artist friends to help them make their creations come true. So Andy Warhol, for example, Billy Kluver has this quote: all of the art projects that I've been worked on have at least one thing in common. From an engineer's point of view, they're ridiculous. Right? And you can replace engineer here with any kind of STEM discipline. Andy Warhol asked him to design a light bulb that would float, so it could be on, but it would float in midair with no wires, because he wanted to fill a room with floating light bulbs. Why? I mean, this is the kinds of questions that engineers like to ask, but in some cases the answers are just not satisfying to an engineer, right? He just wanted to, right? Maybe it was a metaphor for something. Jasper Johns wanted a piece of neon, a neon letter in a painting, so imagine that painting there with a neon letter in it, but he refused to have wires plugged into the wall. So anybody that knows anything about neon signs, like you need to have kilovolts to excite the gas and get the neon to glow, get the gas to glow. And so Billy Kluver and his colleagues at Bell Labs designed the first step-up transformers, right? They stacked some batteries together and they designed a circuit that would increase the voltage from 12 volts to 3,000 volts, right? We hadn't had a need for that before, and now we use them all the time. So this is an example where, because artists are not constrained, I don't want to say not constrained by reality, but they're not constrained by what we think we know, right? They can have ideas that go beyond the, like, let's just do another cell phone kind of thing. Then they come to the engineers, and the engineers, if they're good engineers and they're open to new ideas, they say, instead of saying, well, we can't do that, they say, well, why not? How might we do that, right? And then new things happen. So art and engineering is this very fertile combination of things. From an engineer's perspective, I've been involved for 2 decades working with primarily one creative group. But one of the things that I love about it is that it also releases you. There's ground seats up here that look super comfortable.
Sure.
There's also these guys. There you go.
Thank you.
Nice.
What was I saying? So one of the things that it gives me as an engineer collaborating with an artist is that the kinds of criteria that determine goodness of a solution are very different, right? And if the artist wants X, Y, Z, so Andy Warhol wanted floating light bulbs. Billy Kluver couldn't deliver floating light bulbs, but he took what was then brand new space age material for the space race called Mylar, reflective Mylar. We all know Mylar balloons now. So Billy Kluver made the very first helium-filled Mylar balloons for Andy Warhol's floating cloud room. The criteria for success that an artist has, or let's say artistic projects generally allow more flexibility on the success criteria than an engineering project. And so what that means is engineers can work at the boundary of what they know, and they can push things. And maybe they can't get quite where the artist wanted them to get, but they can get farther than we were before in different ways, right? So there's a certain amount of flexibility. And so when I speak with my collaborator and he wants X, Y, Z, and I say, well, I can only deliver X, Y, he's like, well, that's okay. We'll just change the way we think about the piece. One-on-one collaboration between 2 people from different fields always holds the possibility of producing something new and different that neither of them could have done alone. And this actually leads really well into the project that actually got me started in tech art. And I don't know if that's my next slide. It isn't, so I'll get to there in a second. So what's technology art then? So art and engineering, mixing art and engineering is, I think, an exemplary form of interdisciplinary collaboration. It's not a mechanical engineer working with an electrical engineer. It's working across what Julie Thompson-Klein, who's an interdisciplinarity researcher, would call broad interdisciplinarity, right? There's a pretty big gap in the way that we, in some ways, in the way that we, engineers and artists conceive of ideas, know of knowledge, etc. There's actually, when you look at the working methods of some engineers and some artists, they're actually quite close, but they don't know that until they talk to each other. So it's actually quite interesting. Technology art can challenge us, pushing us, both the people creating, but also the users, the viewers, to new intellectual and, I think, important for art, when we're talking about art specifically, new emotional spaces. And one of the most important qualities for collaboration and for strengthening our social fabric that I was talking about earlier is this idea of being comfortable with ambiguity, not knowing the answer, or maybe knowing that there's more than one right answer, and being okay with that. That's really hard, right? Especially if you're in a STEM discipline at Waterloo. You grew up through high school seeking the right answer. You were taught there is one right answer, you got to find it, or else you're going to fail. Right? Hopefully, you're at a point in your careers, your student careers now, your degrees, where you've had a design course, and so the idea that there's maybe more than one way to solve a problem is starting to settle in, right? But there's nothing like working with an artist to sort of reinforce this idea of being comfortable with ambiguity, right? Because one day they'll say X and the next day they'll say Y, and both of those can be good. And for me, it helps to sort of see, okay, what connects those two things, and now I see where the thought process is going. But this idea of there not necessarily being one right answer, about multiple answers being okay, these are qualities of what engineers and STEM folks call wicked problems, right? The wicked problems that the world has. There isn't one right answer to climate change. There isn't a right answer to food insecurity. There isn't a right answer to water scarcity. And we need to be able to be comfortable with ambiguity. And the one thing that I really like about some of the work that I'll show you is that by being open to interpretation, because it's not a cell phone, right? It doesn't have a specific function. The things that one can create in technology act as what are called boundary objects in the psychological literature, right? So a boundary object is something that different people from different disciplines can come together and they'll interpret it differently. They'll tell different stories about it, and by telling those different stories around a common object, that allows us to see those different perspectives. It solidifies those different perspectives, and it gives you an opportunity to practice dialoguing back and forth. So that's probably enough background. Why don't I sort of take you through some art? So this is a piece called Bubble Machine, and it is by a Swiss-Canadian artist, Ernest Detweiler. He lives just west of Heidelberg in the Waterloo region. And in 2002, when I hadn't even been at the university 2 years yet, the dean's office got a call from Ernest, and he had this commission to do this piece in Switzerland for a show called Art Canal. And the idea was these two old satellite dishes with rotating acrylic discs that have bubble makers. I don't know what to call them, but those, like, you blow on soap bubbles and they make bubbles. Embedded in the acrylic disc rotates around. There's soapy water in the bottom half of that semicircular container. And there are little fans that blow bubbles. So the disc rotates, it picks up more soap. The fans blow the bubbles. And it was about the ephemerality of communication, because these bubbles are sort of trying to talk to each other, but they never get to each other. And Ernest had a problem, and that was that the motor that spins the disc kept dying. And he had, gone online, and ChatGPT didn't exist. The internet barely, 2002, yeah, the internet barely existed. And he had gone to a surplus store online and had bought motors that he thought would work, but he was an artist. He had no way of figuring out what, torque he needed or what voltage would be right. And so he kept buying motors and they kept burning out, and he sort of, the deadline was coming up closer and closer, and so he called the university and he said, is there anybody who can help me? And the dean said, well, we got this guy Gorbet, give it to him, he's the new guy, right? I hadn't done any art at all at this point. I was like an engineer's engineer, So I sat down with Ernest and I asked him about the weights of the discs and the speed he wanted it to rotate and the voltage he had available. And I probably did like 3 hours of calculations and then maybe an hour of web surfing. And I found him motors that lasted 5 years, right? And it was magic to him, and it was magic to me that I could do this simple thing that, was basically like an assignment in my motors class, and help his dream come true, like his creation become real. And I don't know if I've had another experience where it's been so rewarding applying something that is so simple to me to give that to somebody else. And that's where I just got really interested in being able to do these simple things for people who couldn't do them. And in exchange, learning from them. So this was very, what I would call engineering as consultant, right? That kind of model of the interaction between Ernest and I. My name is not on the piece. I don't remember whether he paid me. I don't think he did. But basically, I was consulting. He told me what he needed. I was an engineer. I did the design work. I gave him along, right? Around the same time, my brother and sister-in-law moved from California to Toronto, and there was a Contemporary Art Forum Kitchener and area, CAFCA. It's a biennial now, we were at the 2001 CAFCA, and there was a call for proposals, and Matt and Susan and I looked at each other, and they said we should do something. So we did. We put a proposal in, right? Why not? And so we put in a proposal for the theme of CAFCA in 2002 was Power to the People. It was celebrating 100 years of the arrival in 1902 of public power from Niagara Falls in the Waterloo region. And so it was called Power to the People. At the same time, the internet was brand new. Napster was new. File sharing was the Wild West. You could take copyrighted, you probably still can, don't tell me where. But like Pirate Bay, places like that, right? So Napster is now a legit music service, but it used to be a file pirating service. Anyway. So that whole question of sort of what does oversight mean in this new world where you can have peer-to-peer communication, P2P, but also power to the people. And so we designed a very simple light marquee up there, so it's 25 light bulbs wide by 5 light bulbs tall, and a simple switch panel that sits in the front of Kitchener City Hall, or sat in the front of Kitchener City Hall by the pond there. Very straightforward. Each switch is mapped to a single bulb, and you can put your message, whatever you want, up on City Hall. So no censorship. Literally, you can put whatever you want. Technically, it was a bit of a challenge because with Matt and Susan, we had designed this piece to be interior. The jury liked it so much that they want it outside. So who can tell me how that might change the design of our piece? The electrical engineers in the room. So when we originally designed it, yeah.
Like environmental conditions?
Say again?
Environmental conditions?
Environmental conditions, yeah, specifically what?
Water?
Rain, yeah, yeah. So inside it was gonna be a very simple piece. Run 120 volts to the piece, whole bunch of switches, lots of cabling, but pretty straightforward. Outside, it was really important to us to use these sort of standard household switches because we wanted it to be inviting. So this is an aspect of interface design, right, which we can talk a lot more about afterwards if you like. But when you're designing interactive pieces, you really want the interface to be as accessible as possible, right? Does anybody know Donald Norman, the Norman principles for design? Yeah, okay. So the idea of affordances, when we see an object, it should right away tell us how we are supposed to use it, right? And so everybody knows how to use these light switches. Could we have got some waterproof industrial strength light switches? Absolutely. But people wouldn't have felt like they could go and use it because it's not what they're used to, right? So inside, it meant I had to completely redesign the thing. So here we've got, this is like pre-Arduino. So I've multiple boards running shift registers. So basically 125 switches, 128-bit switch register, sample at 400 hertz, send all the zeros and ones along a cable underneath the fountain through the pump room up to the mezzanine, where each of those feeds into one of 125 relays that switches the main power. Because no LED bulbs, right? So it's 120 volts, yeah, but invisible to the user, right? And that's critical. So this was, working with Ernest was like, wow, I can do these things and make this guy's dreams come true. this was where I really got exposed to the impact that art can have on the viewer. So people did all kinds of things with this display, right? They didn't just put up words, they made happy faces. They created games where, you know, the kind of snake games? So two people would stand at the panel, and you had to have a snake that was 5 lights long, no longer, no shorter, and the snakes chased each other around the board. And so you have to kind of get good at and turning corners was complicated, right? But people had so much fun with it. And because I lived close by, Matt and Susan and I would go and just stand on the other side of King Street and watch what people would do, and it was so fascinating. And it was intended to make people think, right? I believe that art should make people think hopefully differently about some aspect of their world. And so sometimes there were expressions like this up there. Sometimes there were swear words. I mean, lots of fuck, some "F you pigs," to which the cops, you know, were not very happy, and the artistic director actually had to get himself in between some cops on the switch panel to be like, no, this is okay. And why was I saying that? I don't know why I was saying that. So, expressions, lots of different words, people put different things. Oh, so I was standing next to the plinth one day during the exhibition with my artist badge on, and I think the word shit was up there or something. A citizen, a gentleman, came along and he looked up at the board and he said, did you make this? And I said, yes. And he said, is this what you intended? And I said, well, you know, not explicitly, but we also didn't really explicitly want to prevent it. It's a conversation, and you know, if it offends you, then the switches are right there. Like, you know, you can just turn it off. And he kind of huffed and walked off, and it was like, wow, this guy has gotten so used to other people censoring his environment for him that he won't even like turn the switches off, right? And other people asked us, could you not have had some kind of magic? This was early in the internet. The internet did exist, but it was early. People had Blackberries, right? Could you not have had it set up so that I could type a message on my Blackberry and send it to the marquee? And our response was, well, we did think about that, and we could have done it that way. We chose not to. Why do you think we chose not to? Someone else? Yeah.
Yeah, so that if two people want to set messages at the same time, they couldn't have a face-to-face conversation.
Okay, interesting. Okay, yeah, not quite exactly, but yes, that's true, right? It's related to that though. Yeah.
To be there in person.
Yeah. You have to take accountability for what you're putting up, right? Which is sort of what you're saying as well, right? You want to be responsible for the word that goes up there, right? If you're going to put the word fuck up on City Hall, you darn well better be standing right there in public in the middle, putting the word fuck up on City Hall. Yeah.
You're talking about censorship being done for us, and I'm curious, do you think something like this would still go up today at Kitchener City Hall?
It's a great question. I didn't think it would go up then.
Yeah, I'm actually a little surprised too, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm shocked. And I think it probably would not.
Yeah.
And the reason that I say that, you know, quite aside from the way society has evolved, so the question, just for those that couldn't hear it, is, would something like this fly today? What we had not thought about was that the counselors' offices are in a wing of the building over there. And so they had to look out at this all day without any ability to change it. So I think even it became known informally as the swear board. I've been on the Kafka jury in years following, and you know, the swear board comes back all the time. Like, is this another swear board? Quite apart from the way society's evolved, I think very practically that's something that we hadn't taken into account and probably would not fly. But it's a good question. You know, we live in an interesting time of sort of free speech but not free speech, and you know, I don't know. It's a good question. But those are exactly the questions that art is there to answer. This is what I love about art, right? Art pushes us. It's an opportunity to ask those kinds of questions. Because it's open to interpretation, I was able to say to that guy, no, I didn't intend this, right? I did not design, I didn't get the design brief and it said like design a square board to put on Kitchener City Hall, right? Art is open to interpretation, and that allows us to put things out there like my tattoo here, which people always ask me, well, what is it? And my response is, what do you think it is? I don't know, right? So it gives you this opportunity to have a conversation, right? And to push ideas and to push that conversation. So there were expressions of, like this one. There were also other folks who used it. And the downtown Kitchener core is a really interesting space. These guys were really fascinating. And Matt and Susan and I were standing across the street, across King Street, just watching like we were wont to do. And Gabriella, who was the photographer for the catalog, had her tripod set up, and she was taking pictures of the nighttime pictures of the piece. And these guys came along, and they were starting to give her a hard time about being on the space because they wanted to use it. And so we crossed the street and we started talking to them. And at first, they were kind of aggressive. They were like, "Well, who are you?" And so when we said we were the artists that had created it, they were like, "Man, this is like the best thing ever." Because we had given them a way to voice their concerns, their desires, right? Without spray paint, right? And in every context in which we've shown this piece, people have adopted it. People have said, I'm gonna protect this from vandalism. I'm gonna tell others about it. It just becomes this really interesting social sort of experiment. So we got to take this picture with them. And later it was shown in Toronto. And, oh wait, there's another slide that I gotta tell you a story about in a minute, but I'll tell you the Toronto story in a sec. Weed was by far the most common word, aside from people's names. But since not everybody has the same name, weed was definitely the most common collection of letters that went up there. In fact, there was one night when Matt and Susan and I were standing across the street, and there were two kind of mid-30s, maybe early 40s women on the podium, and they were clearly putting up weed. They had got like the W, and there was the E, and they were starting on the third E. And there was a guy off to the side, and he was older. He was like a 60s, 70s. He was leaning on a cane, and they're partway through the third E, and he sort of walks over and starts this conversation with them. And Matt and Susan and I are like, wow, like, yeah, excellent, it's working. They're gonna have a dialogue about what's appropriate. And he turns off all the lights, and then he very quickly puts up the word weed, and he was upset about the kerning. He was sort of pretty sure that they weren't gonna have room to finish the D. So he turned off all the lights, and he muscles them out of the way, and he puts up the word weed, and he turns around and he raises his cane in the air and he goes, weed! And so we went over and talked to them. It turned out he was their dad. And so we were like, oh, darn. But that was pretty funny. This is Toronto on the Drake Hotel. Anybody recognize the Drake Hotel from Queen West West? Yeah. So this was a brand new sort of neo-bohemian high-end bar thing. And this is a rainy Friday night, and you can sort of barely see, but there's a line here for people getting in. And the switch panel was across the street on Queen Street, and someone put up the word ego with like an arrow pointing down at all the people standing in line. So depending where we've put it up, we've also done it in San Jose, the messages are different. And so it's really fascinating because it's this kind of social experiment. Like, what are the important issues? What are the things people are thinking about? And I've got lots more stories about this, but I'm gonna run out of time. So I'm gonna keep going. We can have stories afterwards. And I'm gonna try to speed through. I always have so much to say about P2P. I have so much to say about all these, but I'm gonna try to go faster. This is another piece I did with Matt and Susan called From Me to You. It is a reflection on language, and it was really an opportunity to use these beautiful Nixie tubes that we have. They're 2.5 inches in diameter and 4 inches high, so they're pretty massive. And the idea is that you put a word in, you use the knobs on this like 1920s radio-like thing to change the letters between the word I and you. And whatever word you settle on, there's a computer inside, or a microcomputer, pre-Arduino again, that does a word ladder. So it changes letters one at a time through a 4-letter word dictionary. And so this is one example. So I bump you, I jump you, I hump you, I dump you, I pump you, I pimp you. And I know what's happening in your minds right now, because we're human. But what's interesting about this is that the computer all it's doing is changing letters one at a time, right? But one of the things about this piece is that humans create stories around our experiences. So people would come up to us and they would say, oh, it's got a dirty mind. And I would say, well, actually, it's got no mind at all. If you're interpreting something dirty here, then that's on you, right? And so it's a really interesting social experiment, because people will put in words, they'll see what comes out, and often the words are not connected, but we connect them, because that's how humans kind of evolve in the world, is building a narrative. So we can come back to that if there are questions afterwards. Following that, I had the chance to work again with Matt and Susan on something called Solar Collector. So if you've been down to the Emergency Medical Services Facility or the Waterloo Regional Police Station on Maple Grove Road, down by Sports World Drive, this is out front of both of those buildings. It's I'll just play the video. It's a sort of 3-minute video, and I'll talk over it. Solar Collector was a response to a call for proposals from the region for a dynamic solar-powered sculpture. The location was set, that was part of the call. It had to be at this intersection here. And we wanted to do something that was sort of recognize solar power, but also recognize the sun. So it's 12 shafts, and if you think of each of those shafts as being related to the 12 months, or really the 12 divisions between the summer equinox and the winter equinox, the angles and the length of each shaft is entirely calculated based on the relationship of the sun to that location in the world. So we set out to sort of collaborate with the sun in making this piece, and it turned out beautiful. And isn't that neat, right? It's that is, the sun told us where to put the shafts, what angle to put them at, how long to make them. And it just ended up being this kind of beautiful form, which is really neat. You can go online and you can create a pattern through a web app, and then each night the patterns are cued and then played. This got a lot of international press. We have a pattern archive where our patterns have been sent in from all over the world. And this one is not so much about some kind of deep message. This is about beauty and aesthetics and just kind of really enjoying the experience. We made a lot of design decisions here. The shafts, each shaft is independent from a power and electronics perspective from the other shafts. The only communication they get together is like what is the pattern database, and then each of them runs their own show. What that means is that at different times of the year, different shafts will drop out at different times because they've managed to store different amounts of energy during the day. And that in itself is kind of interesting, right? So in the winter months, the shorter shaft might drop out early. In the summer months, the taller shafts might drop out early. But it was a massive undertaking, and the big thing we learned from this is that the budgets for these kinds of projects need to be very big, right? Matt and Susan and I had never done anything on this scale before, and we estimated 60 person days from design to commissioning. And it was more like 3 years. And we obviously didn't get paid nearly enough for it. The other comment I'll make is that in Europe, a piece like this would be, the contract would be for about 10 times more than it would be in North America. Just the way that Europeans value art is different. But having done that piece led me to a conversation with Philip Beasley, who is an artist and architect who teaches in the School of Architecture here at Waterloo. And he looked me up because the university did an article about solar collector. And it said, you know, Rob Gorbet is an engineer who does shape memory alloys, but also loves art, so they were into this interdisciplinarity, whatever. So Philip looked me up and said, we need to have coffee. You know, he had been working for about a decade on research creation projects to create environments, architectural scale environments, that would pose the question, what would it be like if our environment could sense us, respond to us, if the environment was living, if we had a much more symbiotic relationship with the buildings and environments that we live in? How would that change the way we approach ecology, the use of materials, the way that we think about buildings? And so it's kind of this very speculative question. Remember, this is 2010, but I started working with Philip in 2005, so 2 decades ago, right? Smart building automation systems didn't exist. And he's actually talking about a step further, which we're not at yet, where the buildings can actually sense your emotions, right? So these are, and not saying that we have that technology, right? These are the speculative questions that he wants to pose, that we want to pose through our work together by installing these environments. And he said, oh, you're an engineer, but you also understand art. We should work together. So we've been working together for 20 years. We were selected in 2010 to represent Canada at the Venice Biennale of Architecture, which is kind of like the Olympics of Architecture, if you've heard about the Venice Biennale. It happens every 2 years, and every country has a pavilion, and the country chooses an architect or artist to populate the pavilion with their work. And so we had the honor of being selected to do that. And this was Hylozoic ground. So as you walk in and among these columns that are made of acrylic, basically acrylic chevrons that all get plugged together. These fronds here are actuated by shape memory alloys. There are infrared sensors at the bottom, and as you walk by, the columns respond to you being there. So it's this kind of, you know, lots of people said, oh, it's like Avatar in the Living Forest, and we were like, yes, but we were there before James Cameron. And Brandon was there, right? 2010. So Brandon did a lot of the engineering on Hylozoic ground. We've been continuing this work, and maybe I'll just show you a little bit about the technical side of things. So these are the acrylic chevrons. It literally is hundreds of thousands of these little laser cut acrylic chevrons that are put together like Lego to build this room-sized structure. This is a pre-Arduino microcontroller thing that I designed. There are 40 some odd of those in the sculpture, you know, networked together and all communicating. This is a very early work. The work has evolved since then. This is Amatria, which is installed in Indiana University in Bloomington in Indiana. The intent of Amatria is that it's one of our first what we call test beds. So the data streams and access to the control algorithms are open, and researchers from Indiana University can tap into those to do data analysis, to develop AI algorithms, to control the behavior of the sculpture. So it's a kind of an open system. They've evolved again. I was just in Delft a couple of weeks ago installing Area, which is our newest installation. This is at the Delft Science Center. This one has 60 sensors, 300 actuators of various kinds, 15 channel spatialized sound system, so that you can move sound around the room by controlling different volumes and different channels. And over 500,000 pieces, individually hand-assembled components. This is the, and Brandon, this will be new for you. This is the back-end software controlling area. And what you see on the screen up there is what we're calling a spatialized digital milieu. So the room and every actuator in it, actuator and sensor in it, has a three-dimensional location in a database. We know where all those actuators are. And we input into the room what we call influence engines. So influence engines can be different kinds of things. It might be a sphere that moves spatially around the room and has a particular radius. The radius can be dynamic, the speed can be dynamic. And as the sphere goes past actuators and sensors of different kinds, if those actuators and sensors are subscribed to that kind of influence, then they will trigger, right? If they're not, then they'll ignore it. So you can think about in the bushes, you see the animal moving and you see the leaves rustling, but you don't see the animal, right? And this becomes necessary because you can imagine, as we did in Venice, trying to program every single actuator's response over time, right, at some kind of time envelope. And then if you ever want to change anything, you literally have to pull the microcontroller out of the network, put it on the desk, reprogram it, put it back together. And what's new with the spatialized digital milieu now is that it accepts MIDI controls. So this is just a MIDI control panel, and you can literally play the sculpture. So just by pushing buttons, you can trigger behaviors. This is my brother Matt. He's playing the sculpture right now. He's the brains behind the spatialized digital milieu work. The other thing, just really briefly, is that we're playing now with generative shadows. So this looks like a projector, like there's a white spotlight that's projecting a shadow on the wall, but you'll notice there's other stuff going on there, right? So this little moat that's kind of broken off and swimming around, it's not actually there, obviously, right? So this is what we call living shadows. So this is using projection mapping. So the light here is not from a spotlight, it's from a projector. And we can control in real time the video and create these sort of artificial shadows that move around in the space. And we think of it as telling the sort of hidden story of the sculpture. That again has a MIDI interface. So Kevin, who's controlling it, basically literally has a keyboard, and he can press keys and create new modes and move things around. So things have come a long way since 2010. I don't even recognize it anymore. So what does all this mean for you? So I'll put all of these up. Practice curiosity, get comfortable with ambiguity, develop empathy, and working across disciplines and working with people of different persuasions and different ideas in an open way is one way to practice developing empathy. Active listening, boost your collaborative abilities, right? PRISM is a place where you can do that. And really want to encourage you to become, you may already be, but become, if you already are, become more metacognitive. Spend time thinking about how what you did today changes the you that will be tomorrow, right? You don't have to do that every day, but do it regularly. Because otherwise, spoken as a 56-year-old, your life will be over before you know it, and you won't have really taken time to reflect on what you've learned and what impact you've had. And I would say that tech art is an amazing place to have impact for all the reasons that I've spoken about before. And I really just want to say thank you for being a part of PRISM. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm happy to support PRISM in